For thousands of years, human beings have asked a simple but deeply meaningful question. Where did we come from? Long before modern science, long before laboratories and DNA analysis, ancient cultures were already searching for answers about human origins. Among all these traditions, the biblical account of Adam and Eve remains one of the most influential narratives ever recorded. It has shaped how generations understand identity, purpose, and the shared beginning of humanity. According to the book of Genesis, humanity does not begin with chance or chaos, but with intention. Adam is formed from the dust of the earth and given life through the breath of God. Eve is created as his companion, not as an accessory, but as an essential part of the human story. This account presents humanity as deliberate, meaningful, and interconnected from the very beginning. One question naturally arises from this narrative. What did Adam and Eve actually look like? The Bible does not provide a physical description in the modern sense, and this absence has led to centuries of reflection and interpretation. Some biblical scholars point to the meaning of the name Adam itself, which is connected to the earth or red clay. This has led to the idea that Adam may have had a tone similar to the soil, a natural reddish or brown hue, not fitting neatly into modern racial categories. Rather than describing a specific ethnicity, the text suggests a foundational human appearance, one capable of giving rise to many variations. From a biblical perspective, Adam and Eve are understood as the ancestors of all humanity. This means that within them existed the potential for the wide diversity we see across the world today. Just as two parents in the present can pass down a range of physical traits to their children, the early human family is portrayed as carrying a rich genetic foundation over generations. As people migrated, settled, and formed communities, these traits became more pronounced in certain regions. Skin tone, facial features, and physical characteristics developed through inheritance and history, not through hierarchy or value. This perspective challenges the idea that race defines origin. Instead, the biblical account places unity before division. Humanity begins as one family sharing a common source. According to Genesis, the human story continues through generations until a pivotal moment with the flood in the time of Noah. After this event, the descendants of Noah spread across the earth, and biblical genealogies begin to describe the formation of nations and peoples. These genealogies are not presented as tools for separation, but as a way of tracing connection. They link human diversity back to a shared ancestry, reinforcing the idea that difference does not cancel unity. This raises another important question. If humanity shares a common origin, why do people look so different today? The biblical explanation is not centered on climate alone, nor on random change, but on inheritance, migration, and time. As families moved into different regions, intermarried, and adapted to new environments, distinct traits became more common in certain populations. This process unfolded slowly, shaped by history rather than ideology. Importantly, the biblical narrative does not elevate one appearance above another. It does not describe one group as more original, more pure, or more favored. Instead, it presents diversity as part of creation itself. Human worth is not linked to skin tone, culture, or ancestry, but to being created in the image of God. This idea has deeply influenced Western thought, shaping concepts of human dignity, equality, and moral responsibility. When viewed through this lens, the question of what Adam and Eve looked like becomes less about assigning a label and more about understanding potential. The first humans are portrayed as the source from which all people emerge, carrying within them the capacity for every ethnicity and culture that would follow. This view encourages humility rather than division. It reminds us that before nations, borders, and labels, there was simply humanity. The story of Adam and Eve is not only about the distant past. It continues to speak to the present, inviting reflection on how identity is formed and how history is understood. Whether approached as faith tradition or worldview, This narrative has shaped how millions of people think about who they are and where they come from. At its core, it presents a vision of humanity that is unified at its origin and diverse in its expression. In a world often focused on differences, this ancient account quietly reminds us of a shared beginning, a common story, and a deep connection that runs beneath all human variation. As the biblical narrative continues, the story of early humanity begins to expand beyond the garden. Adam and Eve are not presented as symbolic figures frozen in time, but as the beginning of a long human journey. Their descendants populate the earth, forming families, communities, and eventually entire civilizations. The Bible describes this expansion not as a smooth ascent, but as a story marked by choice, consequence, and moral struggle. Violence, pride, and separation appear early in the human record, reminding readers that humanity carries both creativity and conflict within itself. This tension reaches a turning point with the account of the flood in the time of Noah. According to Genesis, the flood represents a moment of judgment, but also preservation. Humanity does not end, it is refined. Noah and his family survive, and through them, the human story continues. This moment is crucial because it becomes the foundation for understanding how the ancient world repopulated. From Noah come 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, whose descendants are described as spreading across different regions of the world. Biblical genealogies trace the origins of nations back to these lineages, not to promote division, but to explain dispersion. In these genealogies, geography and ancestry are intertwined. Peoples settle in different lands, form distinct cultures, and develop unique identities over time. The Bible does not describe this process in modern scientific terms, but it offers a framework that emphasizes movement, inheritance, and time. From this perspective, diversity is not an accident, nor is it a deviation from an original design. It is the result of humanity spreading out across the earth, carrying with it the imprint of a shared beginning. As generations pass, differences become visible. Language changes, traditions form, and physical traits vary. Yet beneath these differences, the biblical narrative maintains a consistent message. All people remain connected through a common ancestry. This idea stands in contrast to later historical periods, when identity became tied to power, territory, or exclusion. In the biblical worldview, ancestry explains relationship, not superiority. One of the most misunderstood aspects of these ancient genealogies is the assumption that they exist to rank peoples. When read carefully, they do the opposite. They remind the reader that every nation comes from the same source. No group appears without context, and no lineage exists in isolation. This understanding shaped how early biblical writers viewed humanity. They did not see the world as divided into unrelated groups, but as a family that had grown large and complex over time. This perspective also influences how physical appearance is understood. Skin tone, facial structure, and other traits are presented as variations within humanity, not markers of value. The Bible never suggests that closeness to the original humans determines worth. Instead, worth is rooted in being human itself. This is a subtle but powerful idea, especially when viewed against the backdrop of later history, where physical difference was often used to justify division. By tracing all peoples back to a shared origin, the biblical narrative quietly undermines such thinking. It affirms that difference does not negate kinship. Another important element in this story is the role of memory and tradition. These accounts were preserved not simply to record events, but to transmit meaning. They helped ancient communities understand who they were and how they related to others. Identity in this sense was not just personal, but collective. Knowing where one came from shaped how one lived and how one treated others. This is why the story of Adam and Eve remains foundational. It anchors identity at the beginning of the human story, before nations, before borders, and before conflict. It reminds the listener that humanity begins together, even if history later pulls people apart. In modern times, discussions about human origin often focus on biology alone. Genetics, fossils, and migration patterns offer valuable insights into how populations developed. Yet the biblical account operates on a different level. It speaks to meaning rather than mechanism. It asks not only how humanity developed, but what humanity is. It presents humans as relational beings connected to one another and accountable for their actions. This moral dimension is central to the story. Adam and Eve are not remembered primarily for their appearance, but for their role as the first humans to make choices that shaped the course of history. Their story is one of responsibility, consequence, and hope. Even after failure, the human story continues. Life goes on, families grow, and history unfolds. This continuity is important. It suggests that human identity is not erased by mistakes, but carried forward through time. When viewed as a whole, the story of Adam and Eve functions as a lens rather than a conclusion. It offers a way of seeing humanity that emphasizes origin, connection, and purpose. It does not eliminate mystery, nor does it answer every question. Instead, it provides a starting point for reflection. For many, it invites a reconsideration of how identity is defined. Rather than beginning with difference, it begins with unity. Rather than focusing on separation, it emphasizes shared roots. In a world shaped by migration, conflict, and cultural exchange, this ancient narrative continues to resonate. It reminds listeners that beneath layers of history, ideology, and identity, there is a deeper story that connects all people. The story of humanity begins not with division, but with a single family shaped from the earth, breathing the same air and stepping together into the unfolding journey of human history.